In this video, we're going to take a look at William Lane Craig on the Canaanite genocide. Obviously, with me, this is a well-trodden path. I've been a vocal critic of Craig for years on this issue, going back to, I don't know, 10 years ago when I wrote a series of articles critiquing him, and also in my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, and also in multiple other videos. I want to revisit this issue. I think it should remain in the top of our minds because it's a shocking fact that many Christians still defend the killing of civilians in the name of God, including women and children. And until we stamp that terrible, dangerous belief out within the church, I think it's something well worth continuing to dialogue about. In this video, which was posted on Craig's YouTube channel or one of his YouTube channels about 9 years ago, you're going to see him wearing a Hawaiian shirt and white pants. I'm not sure what the context was, but he's looking very, very good, very dapper. And a gentleman has just asked a question from the audience asking, well, what do we do with passages like Joshua 6 that describe the eradication of all civilians, including men, women, and children living in Jericho, which looks like genocide? How do we understand that? We're going to look at Craig's response, which was just about a minute long, and then I'm going to offer some quick rebuttal to that. Like I said, Bill Craig is looking great here. He's got the Hawaiian shirt and the white pants, and he's just about to talk about killing civilians in the name of God. So the gentleman has asked the question. He's already launched into his answer. We're going to now join that in progress.
I have a couple of questions of the week where I wrestle with this issue. And what I tried to do there is to defend an ethical theory that would allow God to be perfectly good and all-powerful, and yet to issue these sorts of horrifying commands, such as to go in and kill everyone in the city, men, women, and children. And I think that the theory that I've laid out here allows us to understand that. Because if God is the source of our moral duties, that means that God could command a person to do something which, in the absence of a divine command, would have been sin. But given the divine command, it now becomes the right thing for that person to do. So if the armies of Israel, for example, had just decided on their own to go in there and slaughter the people, that would have been wrong. It would have been, say, murder or war crimes. But given a divine command, they now have a moral duty to do that, and therefore they have the obligation to carry out that command, horrifying as it might be. So
I just have to say, at the last scene, when it cuts to a different camera angle and you see Craig talking, and then all these people leaning back in their chairs, probably they had a Danish and a coffee at the buffet table in the morning, and now this professor and apologist is calmly explaining how it can be God's will to massacre children and women. It's just kind of a surreal image. So, what should we think about what should we think about Craig's response? What Craig does is he offers a meta-ethical theory of divine commands. And it is at this point that many critics kind of, I think, miss the mark because they criticize Craig just for appealing to the idea that moral obligations could be explained in terms of divine commands. And that's not the problem, actually, with Craig's view. The problem with Craig's view is the range of things that God can command on his view. So, for example, a theist could believe that moral good is in some way identified with or constituted by God's nature. It's just fixed. Things that are intrinsically morally good are just fixed by God's nature. However, moral obligations are different than moral value. So, moral value, good and evil, is just some objective value or disvalue morally of certain actions or states of affairs in the world. But an obligation is with respect to the nature of the moral good, a certain onus upon a moral agent to act in a particular way with respect to that moral value. So you have an obligation, for example, to help the poor, uh, and that would be a moral obligation. And then the objective value is the evil of the disvalue, let's say, of people lacking enough goods. When that obtains, you, as an agent with sufficient means, may have a moral obligation to help them. So there's the objective evil of lacking goods, and then the obligation that that triggers in the moral agent who has sufficient goods to then share. And you could take this view. You could say the moral goodness, moral value is identified with or somehow constituted by God's nature, but the obligations that we have to act in response to good and evil are created by God's commands. And we should also be clear on something else here. By command, we're not saying simply that God issues to you some discrete command and says, hey, you go do this now. It could be that the commands that God gives creatures are identical with natural law or with some other understanding of the way that we come to know moral obligations. It could be equivalent to a utilitarian account of the good. For example, in principle, you could have it if utilitarianism is true, and we always ought to act so as to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number, then that now becomes the overriding moral command, which on this account God has issued. So you may identify what the moral good is through a utilitarian calculation, but the obligation of it is constituted by the command that God made it so. Hopefully that's not too confusing. The main points I just want to make here at the outset is appealing to a theory of moral obligations as somehow being constituted by or identical to commands God gives to creatures is not in and of itself a problem, because the range of possible commands could map reliably onto what we understand to be good versus evil. Where it becomes a problem is where you have an unrestricted understanding of divine commands, such that God can command things that appear to us clearly to be evil. That's the problem. And that's the problem with Craig's view here. Think about it like this. If if Craig's view is truly unrestricted, and that God can command anything at all, uh, well, let's consider that for a moment, which certainly seems to be a reasonable implication, because on Craig's view, God is commanding human beings, soldiers, to massacre infants, small children, women, the elderly, the mentally and physically handicapped, to stab them, to smite them, to bludgeon them, to massacre them all. But because it's his command, it's not a sin. It's their moral obligation to do it. And if the nature of moral obligation is like this, such that there is truly nothing that God cannot command, well, then you'd have moral anarchy. I mean, God, for example, could command the rape and torture of people. I mean, rape and torture, I don't think is intrinsically worse than bludgeoning and killing. In fact, many forms of killing, such as would have been occurring in ancient Near Eastern warfare, would themselves be a form of torture, because a person would be stabbed multiple times, disemboweled gradually, they'd slowly die, and that would be an enormous amount of suffering inflicted upon them, which is additional torture along with the killing act itself. And so, if God can command the genocidal killing of civilian populations, he can also command rape and torture. Except again, on Craig's view, the rape and torture, if God had issued the command to rape and torture, it would be an obligation to do that. But this is crazy. Surely rape and torture could never be something that we are obliged to commit. And most Christians seem to be pretty clear on that. But if they're clear that God could never command the rape or torture of people, they should be equally clear that God could never command massacring of civilians, including women and children and infants. That's no less obvious than that it is wrong to torture and rape people. But then what that means is that it's no answer at all to say these things aren't bad because God commanded them, because killing civilians is surely among the things God could never command, just like rape and torture are among the things God could never command, even if their obligations are things that are constituted by God's divine commands. These could never be among them. So I find Craig's entire apologetic response here by appealing to divine commands to be an abortive attempt to defend his particular hermeneutic and exegesis, his particular reading and understanding of the Bible, and in this case, Joshua. And as a result, we ought to reject that. That doesn't mean, again, that we have to reject a theory that understands moral obligations to be constituted by divine commands. All we need to say is that if they are constituted by divine commands, the commands that can be possibly constituted do not include things like rape, murder, or torture. And that makes good sense to me.